It gives me great pleasure to start this evening. My name is Liz Plater-Zyberg. I'm the Dean of the School of Architecture, and this evening's presentation is part of our fall lecture series, which continues through this month, which is the AIA Celebrate Architecture Month, in which we, as many other institutions in town, bring a number of events to the public's attention related to architecture. Just to give you an idea of what else will be happening here in the next few days, first I would bring your attention to the AIA's website if you wish to see what all the other events of the month are. Only a few of them take place here. They take place all over town. Coming up will be a lecture by Max Strang called Environmental Modernism. That will take place on Tuesday, November 17th. Our continuing series of U.S. Green Building Council local chapter presentations will then continue on a Wednesday, November 18th presentation by Olga Alvarez about labeling of green products. On Thursday, November 19th, there will be a presentation and a panel on a recently published book, Miami Modern Metropolis, which has a series of essays related to 20th century Miami architecture. And then beyond that, there will be one final green building lecture December 16th. So we welcome you back for any of those, and if you would like to be receiving announcements that you're not receiving, we have a basket here you can drop in your name and email. This evening's event is coupled with the inaugural meeting of the Advisory Council for our new Masters in Real Estate Development and Urbanism program. This program has its first full-time class of students this year. We started with a part-time group who performed fabulously last year, bringing us to the final four in the ULI Heinz competition, setting a high standard for the full-time students this year. And so we have brought together an illustrious group of advisors from the development community, literally from around the country, who will be meeting with us tomorrow morning, and many of them are in the room this evening. One of them, of course, is Robert Davis, from whom you will hear this evening. Robert will be speaking, will be interviewed by Dr. Charles Bohl, Chuck Bohl, who's the director of the master's program, who's been a faculty member of the school for some years and has taught both the architects and the real estate students. And Chuck was instrumental, in fact, the driving force behind starting this new program, which is a partnership with the School of Business Administration and the School of Law. So we may have some denizens from those two parts of the university, and we welcome you if you're here in the room with us. We all need to work together. So on with the introduction, and there may be some time for questions afterwards, right? To introduce Robert, he was born in Birmingham, Alabama, attended Antioch College, and then went on to the Harvard School of Business. He was planning to go on to study architecture. He was accepted at the Yale School of Architecture. I happen to know that he, along the way, developed quite an extensive architecture library, but he stopped short of that second degree and came to South Florida to begin his career in real estate development. I met Robert in what must have been the mid to late 70s, and I only found out tonight that, in fact, before that meeting, he worked with affordable housing. His first work was with Ken and Lynn Treaster, some of you know them, and he worked on low-income housing projects with them and eventually with the Alcoa company. My meeting with Robert, I should say Andres and my meeting, was brought about by Susan Lewin, who was the editor of House Beautiful at that time and had her eye out for people around the country who were doing interesting things. And she told Robert, whose work she knew as a developer, and he was working already in Miami as a developer of other things besides affordable housing. And she said, you have to meet the people who just started Arquitectonica. And thus began a long story. So this is like 25 or 30 years ago, right, Robert? It's a long time. 27, he's counting. Suffice it to say that I think it's really wonderful to have him here tonight, not only for the real estate students, but for all the design students, because Robert is and has all of his career been a developer who from the beginning understood that developing land is in fact community building, and that it's not just about finance and architecture, which are the areas he started out with in his training, but that in fact there's an opportunity for integrating environmental responsibility, social cohesion and support in community, and economic sustainability. And I've put that word sustainability, attached it to the economy, because I think that's something that we're all very concerned about right now. And indeed, when Robert started working on Seaside, it was not a dissimilar time of modest resources, both not only for potential buyers, but for investors and for developers. And so what people probably understand the least about Seaside is, and this might be covered at some point this evening, is that it was a kind of low leverage model that at that time was a sustainable and low risk way to go, and still could present a model for current and future work. While Chuck is asking certain questions to get Robert going, we will have a reel of photos on the screen above. We hope it's not too distracting from the words and the people below. Robert, of course, has had many experiences and achievements beyond Seaside. He lives in San Francisco currently. But the photos really are about that beginning that was so important to not only the world of new urbanism, but indeed the world of sustainability and livability that we hear about so much today. And so we're focusing on that visually, but I think the conversation will range more widely than that. So I won't go into the numerous recognitions of Robert and his wife Daryl for their work, but they have been recognized repeatedly and internationally, and we are extremely pleased to welcome Robert this evening to have this conversation in front of you. So please welcome Charles Bowl and Robert Davis.
Thank you for coming out. Robert, times are tough. All the food is gone, and I think the only thing left over there has no calories in it. We're really thrilled to have you here, and from, I think, probably some pretty humble beginnings, your work has really come to influence a lot of people in a lot of different walks of life. And I had the pleasure of helping to award the NOLA Award to you and to Daryl for your work in Seaside that came from Seaside Florida a couple of years ago. And it was remarkable at the time, the people who came out and the appreciation they had from all different walks of life. So thank you for coming and sharing this time with us tonight. We'll do our actor studio format here, and we don't mind if you're distracted by the images either, because we won't be so interesting to look at after a while. Liz introduced some of your background. Is there anything else you might like to tell us about yourself any formative experiences in your early life or places where you grew up that were a big influence on you?
Well, I grew up in Birmingham and on the beaches near Seaside, where our families would spend the entire summer. And I guess the most formative experience was probably building sandcastles with my grandfather, who was a great builder of all sorts of things, mainly a department store, but he loved laying brick and laying block and digging in the yard and building stuff.
So he had a department store, and that was in Birmingham.
Right. And Seaside was actually purchased as a site for a summer camp for its employees. And his partner thought that was a kind of dumb idea. So I ended up inheriting the Seaside property instead of stock and family department store properties.
Before we go too far to Seaside, too far ahead, Liz mentioned your education involved two very different schools. What led you to one and then to the other? What would you say about your educational experience?
Well, I think when I was 17, I really didn't want to go where my family wanted me to go, which was Harvard. And so I went to the opposite school, the most radical school in the country at the time, Antioch College, which is actually a terrific school, because it had this work-study program. At the time, it had some of the best teachers, and it was small enough that you really got to know the teachers.
And what did you study?
I studied history, and I did my senior thesis on Hernan Cortez, and a figure who is roundly adored in the country he conquered, but a very interesting figure.
Were any of your relatives, you mentioned the department store, but were any of your relatives active in other areas of real estate? Were they developers?
No, other than building department stores. Really, and my grandfather just loved building things onto his house. The house was like Thomas Jefferson's house, constantly a construction site.
So how did you come by this occupation? How did you find your way into real estate?
Well, I had admired not so much the architecture of John Portman, but his career choice of being an architect-developer. And so, as Liz mentioned, I was going to go to architecture school after business school, but became a draft evader instead, a college teacher at a small African-American college in Texas, and then at Antioch College, my alma mater, where I worked in administration and admissions.
Part of the genesis of the program here has to do with many alumni who came to the same conclusion that they might like to be the developer as well as the architect.
Well, I realized even then that being an architect and waiting for great commissions was probably going to be a frustrating process. So creating my own commission seemed like a more sensible approach.
Did you apprentice in any sense? Was there anyone who was a mentor who you learned from?
Well, the Treaster brothers were great mentors. They were really flamboyant, interesting characters here in Miami. Ken in particular had a lot of imagination and a lot of flair. It was very odd and interesting being in this development company, which they sold to a Midwestern company from Pittsburgh. The Midwestern guys came down here and just did not understand these Jewish wheeler dealers at all.
So when was this time period? When were you here?
This was in the early 70s, 71, 72. And I worked for a guy named Joe Cantor, who was also a good mentor. He taught me about buying real estate. I was so eager to have him buy me something so I could play with it and develop it. And that was the middle of the building boom, one of South Florida's many real estate bubbles. And he said, just wait, stick around long enough, and we will buy at the bottom of the market, and that's when you make your money.
What were some of those early projects, or where did you work?
Well, I finished up let's just back up. I started a low-income housing project for the Treesters for Housing Club of America that was to go in Washington, D.C. And it was a real eye-opener for me. It was something like 800 units of low-income housing concentrated on a very small site in a lower middle class neighborhood in Washington near Catholic University. And I had been a community organizer when I was a faculty member at Houston Tillotson, and to some degree continued that at Antioch. And I was on the other end of a community organization that truly wanted to ride me out of town on the rail. And they were very concerned about their neighborhood being ruined by that much concentration of low-income people. And I couldn't accuse them of being racist because most of them were African Americans. They were just genuinely concerned, as they should have been, about concentrated poverty. So that was my first eye-opener about this really being a wrong-headed idea. On the plane back from Washington once, I took out my pocket calculator with the computer center and played with the numbers and realized that we were spending something on the order of $35,000 per unit, including all the government subsidies, subsidizing very rich people in tax shelters in order to produce housing for the poor that would be, they were going to be occupying our future slums. And we could have produced this housing for about $22,000 a unit if we had not had all the FHA bureaucracies and all the kind of bizarre subsidy programs that were required. If we simply did the Milton Friedman approach of creating housing vouchers, or we did what subsequently, a few years ago, we had a Seaside Institute program on extending the Home 6 program, would have been the housing policy for your administration had been like. And what we realized from a Republican developer of apartments, Ron Zerwilliger, who was the biggest apartment developer in the country, was that if you leveled the playing field, you could require every developer to include a reasonable percentage of affordable workforce housing and even very low-income housing. And he had no problem with the marketability of that. He said, I'll only do that in Montgomery County, Maryland, or some other place that forces my competition to do it. If it's a level playing field to do it.
Were there things out of the work you did as a community organizer that helped you, or did it more reveal kind of the problems with those early projects?
Well, I mean, it helped me see things from the perspectives of residents and citizens of the neighborhood to think about what I was doing much more in human terms than in the abstract terms of design, finance, construction.
So what came next? What came after the Treester years with the 800-unit project?
Well, I went out on my own, almost inadvertently. I bought a piece of land that I was going to share with two other guys. We were going to build 3 houses for ourselves and 3 houses that we would rent out. And the deal fell apart. So I ended up being the developer of a 9-unit townhouse project. And I realized that I couldn't hold down a day job and do this 9-unit townhouse project because at the scale of 9 units, you can't afford to hire anybody to do anything. You have to do it all.
And where was that?
This was in Coconut Grove. It's a little enclave called Serendipity on McDonald Street.
Okay. And you survived that?
I survived that. We actually made a fair amount of money. So much so that I was overconfident and took on a slightly bigger 10-unit project at another price point. This one was called Apogee. And my market timing was perfect on that one. It came to market right in the middle of the mid-70s bursting of the real estate bubble in Miami.
So you're familiar with how cruel the cycle can be.
I'm very familiar with that. And in retrospect, the lessons I learned at Apogee were key to the success of Seaside, because I developed a severe allergy to leverage and a very strong desire for staying power. So I realized I managed to hang on to Apogee, but just barely, and only because it was only 10 units. But it was leveraged 80% of the total development cost.
And now Apogee was nothing like Seaside, in fact, maybe the opposite. Can you
Right.
just describe what that was and why you went, in terms of the concept of what you were building?
Well, first of all, yeah, it's a small urban infill project, and because it's so tiny, 10 residential units, it's only one use, and that's residential. 10 identical row houses of a very modernist architectural style. They're really 1920s Corbusier International style buildings. I'm still very proud of it. I think it's a great project. It has aged well and held up pretty well. It looks awfully good.
So you survived that.
I survived that.
Those were tough times. This was
Right.
mid-70s. You come out of that. And so what are the beginnings of Seaside? How do you decide what's next?
Well, I had one other project where I had partnership problems, which probably taught me another good lesson, which is either you have partners you really like and you really understand what you're trying to do, or you don't have partners at all. And this was one called Longview, which is also quite a beautiful project. It got built more or less as we designed it, but it lost a lot of money for the person who bought it from us. And then I decided to take off some time and try to lick my wounds and figure out what I wanted to do next. So we did what we have called the Travels by Antioch. We bought a Citroen de Chevaux, which was this silly little car that looked like a snail with a sardine can top that peeled back. And we drove slowly through southern France and coastal Italy and got down as far as Paestum and studied coastal towns. And we kind of came back, decided to move up to the Florida Panhandle and be pioneers.
And so this brings us back to, this is your grandfather who
Right.
first acquired the camp.
Right.
But it had just been sitting there. Was there an actual plan of what?
My grandfather actually did a plan for a small piece of it that he named Dreamland Heights. We recycled the name for Stephen Hall's building. And actually cut the streets in. I had some aerials showing the streets cut. It was a very conventional subdivision. He also gave some land to the University of Alabama at Birmingham to build a conference center. And the second attempt to try to get the university actually to do something with that land was what brought me to Architectonica. Elizabeth Andreas and I formed a team to focus on doing a very modest project using the closest approximation we could come to at the time for vernacular houses on a kind of spiral road with a little meeting center on the beachside. It turned out that the university wasn't ready to do it, and we really weren't ready to design the development. I think the end result of our realization that the building designs were very diagrammatic and very abstract led us to doing more travels by land yacht through the coastal southeast to take photographs and sketches and measurements and try to figure out how this stuff worked. And over time, we saw that almost everything that we were looking at was in the context of small towns. And Liz and Andreas were the ones who figured out that this ought to be designed as a small town, not just as another resort development.
So you're traveling, you're kind of soaking things in, you're spending time with some architects, and coming to different ideas than anything you built before and what was being built at the time. And it sounds like the earlier sketches and ideas didn't exactly come together as what you were thinking. What was the next step? There was, in fact, what we would call now a charrette, right?
Yeah, this was, I think, the first of the modern-day charrettes, because I wanted to accelerate the design process and spend less time and less money doing the master plan. And so I suggested to Andreas that he bring the entire design team up to Seaside, and we would use our house and the porch of the house as a place to do all the sketches. And for, I think, about 2 weeks, in which it rained almost every day, Andreas and Teofilo and Ernesto and Victoria and the Reyes brothers and who else was there, came from Willie and Leah's Quonset hut to Seaside every morning, and we would sit around and drink a lot of espresso and try to figure out what we were going to do in this place.
Now, you have to envision you're seeing these images above you, and none of that's there while they're doing this, right?
Yeah, but it's just a front. At that time, there were 2 houses and a dirt street that led to a footpath that had been carved through the scrub oak down to the beach.
There are also some great photos. So the names you're hearing are still, in fact, many faculty members here at the school, and there's great photos showing them very youthful looking and inventing, helping to invent really this, or remember in many ways, this way of building and designing.
We were talking earlier about this wonderful moment when they all arrived in this great green station wagon and started coming out, and everyone was wearing black sunglasses. And all of the natives looked at these strange creatures that were emerging from the station wagon. And of course, all of these people had just gotten there from Miami, looked around blinking and looked at this very strange and overly lit landscape.
So you have land, you start to have an idea, you have a plan coming together, but you don't really have a lot of money to do this, right?
But we have no money.
You have no money. So
we're financing our life and the planning on what we had made by selling one lot on the very eastern beachfront of Seaside.
we have a little bit of it.
Go ahead, a little bit of it, but not enough to do much with it.
So you go to the bank, you get a great big loan, and right?
Well, we don't. We don't have any credit either. So what we do is we actually did go to the bank and get enough money to build 2 houses, one of which was a sales office, one of which we lived in. It became the model home. We also put up what we call the Seaside Saturday Market, which was just some canvas stretched over big picnic tables, and invited people to bring arts and crafts and flea market items and things of that sort. Daryl set up the most beautiful vegetable stand in the Panhandle and looked like a display of produce at Fauchon. And we were in business. We actually had to over-collateralize the loans on these houses. It required 3 lots to borrow enough money to build one house.
So you have a couple houses, you've got a nice location, and you're along Route 38 where people are passing by, and you're stopping to buy some fruit or something from your stand. You're not, I'm guessing you're not taking out big ads in the Panhandle newspapers with beautiful models laying out on the beach. How did you market this idea? How did you communicate to people?
Well, people would occasionally stop, and we actually created what we call the porch rocker test. If they would sit on a porch rocker or a porch swing, drink some iced tea, and actually sit there and talk to us for more than a few minutes, then there were real prospects. Most people just wanted to pick up brochures and go. And we did have some brochures which Daryl and I had designed. I had written, and they were, I'm actually really proud of them. They're very amateurish in terms of the graphic qualities and the production values. But they talked about things that I keep going back to, like the luxury of simplicity and timelessness, and the notion that these houses were going to be built out of time-tested materials that would last for several generations with reasonable maintenance.
And it was actually, I've actually shown students in class aerials and images of what constitutes the Panhandle, the typical type of development up along the beach, the wall of condominiums, the boutique shops. So, I mean, you had a very particular vision, and you're talking about the simplicity. If it was the concept was not what Seaside would eventually evolve into, kind of I've heard you describe it in the past as a holiday town, or other people talk about it as a horizontal hotel because it's a rented example. But the original vision, talk about the original vision of the simplicity.
Well, we did think that it would be a holiday town, but we had never envisioned ourselves running a big hospitality operation, which eventually we did. We never even quite understood the whole vacation rental management idea at the beginning. But we did think that people would be using these houses part-time, that they would spend the summers there as I had as a child. And what we were marketing was the idea that you could have this place that would be central to your family's life over several generations, and that it was more likely, in fact, that your grandchildren would have this place than they would the place in Birmingham or Atlanta, because with modern social worries and mobility, kids go away to college, they disperse, they don't come home. And this would be a place that could be home for people for longer, most likely, than the so-called primary home.
And right from the beginning, the vision was it was a walkable place. It was a slower paced.
It was designed around walkability, around the career diagram, which already existed at that time, of an adult with a child in tow, and the 10-minute distance that those two people could actually cover, which was about a quarter mile, which is the radius of Seaside. It was also designed at a time when we were feeling less affluent. It started, our first years were in the middle of the worst real estate recession that we had had since the Depression. Not quite as bad as the one we're in now, but pretty close. And we were at the end, in retrospect, we didn't know we were at the end, but we were in an oil shortage. So we assumed that going forward, most cars would be compact, they wouldn't get used very much, that people would dry their clothes on clotheslines, that they would sit on their front porches until the house cooled down enough to go inside, We wouldn't be using air conditioning a lot. And that we would be living a more relaxed, slower paced, lower impact life. I think that we were just about 30 years too early.
It worked out beautifully for Seaside, but it's good you weren't in the car business at that time. Right?
Pardon?
It's good you weren't in the car business at that time.
Right.
Although now we're coming back to that. How about the team of people that you had to bring together to realize that very slow at first, mostly done just by yourselves, but then as it moves forward, and especially if you needed help with traffic, transportation planning issues, or environmental issues come up, or legal issues with a homeowners association, how do you find those people who, it's not like you could find new urbanist consultants anywhere to come and understand what you were doing?
Well, we found consultants gradually who were sympathetic to the idea of what came to be called the new urbanism. We actually didn't hire a traffic consultant until the state forced us into developing a regional impact study. And at that point, I found Rick Hall. I can't remember how, but this was his first urbanist project. Of course, it was the first urbanist project. And it took some convincing, but he finally drank the Kool-Aid and was able to persuade some of his colleagues at the state DOT that having 14 curb cuts in a half mile was okay. It's actually would disperse traffic instead of creating a traffic nightmare, which they assumed by all of their standards it would. Our first homeowners documents were simply recycled apogee documents that the local county attorney, who also was our attorney, simply changed the names on. They proved to be a disaster, by the way. We'll talk about that later on. And then we found Doris Goldstein, who had never done any of this. She'd actually done a little bit of work for Sandestin, the conventional golf course development. And a friend of mine who was on their development team said, well, I've got this woman who recently left the big law firm because she wanted to raise her children. She works out of the house. She's very smart, you'll like her, and she won't charge you very much. So that sounded great.
All that right there.
So Doris became the new urbanist attorney along with Dan Sloan a bit later.
What as long as we're on it, what are some differences between what you would do for a homeowners association document compared to what was used for Hatch?
Well, Doris and I are going to start writing a book this winter on that, but and it probably is a book's worth of stuff to say, but I certainly would approach it as she and Dan have started doing as a constitutional problem. This is not simply a problem like that of the average condo development where the developer's going to build and leave, and you simply have to figure out how to manage those areas that are not privately owned. So I think there are a lot of issues of governance that require more thought. One of the primary ones that later communities have thought about is how do you ensure long-term support for the cultural institutions that community needs, beyond just keeping the streets clean. And how do you make sure that the public realm is actually a public realm, and it stays public, and it stays, doesn't get closed off by the settlers who, unlike the pioneers, had not drunk the Kool-Aid, and very often want to change it into something more like the gated community back in Atlanta that they lived in most of the time.
And many of us have that experience, even in new urbanist communities where we are told to put our camera away or ask why we're taking pictures.
Which are what?
We're told to put our cameras away or ask why we're taking pictures. So sometimes it doesn't feel like a public realm, even in some new urbanist communities, but that's very important, what you're talking about.
No, I think that, the default setting for American land use politics and thinking is NIMBYism. or bananas, and build absolutely nothing anywhere near anything. And so we, even people who bought into the new urban community haven't necessarily bought into the vision.
Talk a little bit more about how Seaside was built very incrementally. Again, a very different model than a conventional model of development, and it was quite slow at first. But there was also a place-making aspect to that as well. Tell us about that.
Well, we discovered, for example, when we had to put up 3 lots as collateral, that on those same 3 lots we had enough area that we could put septic tanks in, so we avoided the building of the sewage treatment plant until we got to about 30 or 40 lots. And at that point, then the density picked up and got us to the point where we had to buy a package plant, which we were able to abandon. But that was hard, that became part of this whole pay-as-you-go approach of building one street at a time, because that's all we could afford to build. Lining it with houses as quickly as possible, and even before the houses went in, we would build a picket fence in front of the lot, and as soon as we had sold the lot, we would, this was our first sales manager's idea, we put up a sign in what was the gate of the picket fence that said Joe and Mary Smith and Buffy and Junior and whoever it was, and the dog's name. Got as many people on there as many names as we could.
And the town or city where they came
from. Right, and the city where they came from. And what you realize is that, especially in a region as small as the Southeast, it's not 6 degrees of separation, it's 3 or 4. So everybody knew somebody who knew Joe and Mary. And, it created a kind of credibility and reality to this place, even when it was not quite populated. But the main thing, and this was something we discovered when we had our first sessions of mainly DPZ clients who had difficulty in their first few years of development. Almost all of them had believed their civil engineers and had taken advantage of the economies of scale. It's a lot cheaper per linear foot to build 3 or 4 miles of street, sewer, and water, and all that than it is to do it a few hundred feet at a time. But they were all sitting there with projects that weren't selling very quickly and looked empty because they would have one house on one street, another house in the next street, and it looked underpopulated and as if it were not succeeding in the marketplace.
There's a lot of those places out there right now.
Oh, yeah.
So the project built out at some point, it actually takes off. Early houses are very modest, but then the project takes off. But it takes off not in the direction you necessarily expected, whereas some people might have had second homes, might have thought to retire there at one point. Then it changes to this really income properties. The houses become income properties, and it starts behaving almost like this horizontal hotel. But this isn't your business. This isn't your business model either to be managing rental property or even running a resort with commercial property and restaurants and so forth. How did you evolve into this whole different area of real estate?
Well, we actually did want to be in the business of renting restaurants and stores because we started out with the Seaside Saturday Market was a retail rental at a very crude and primitive level. And we even had a restaurant the first year. I sold boiled shrimp and gumbo, and Daryl had the vegetables, and we cook up everything the next Sunday after the market and bring it back the following Saturday. And then 2 years later, we started the Seaside Shrimp Shack as a restaurant, and that became the Seaside Grill. And it wasn't until several years into Bud and Alley's that I was able to get rid of the restaurant and get Scott and Dave to take it over, and I could stop losing money in the restaurant business.
So on the restaurant and the retail side, there is a very interesting evolution taking place. And I know both you and Daryl was very involved in this. And you benefited, or I don't know if it was accidental or just because of the economics of it, from having opportunities for people to start businesses at a very small scale, and for you to create places for them to do it that didn't cost you a lot, and then to graduate upward.
The phasing of the retail was similar to that of the houses. We couldn't afford the big buildings that we had designed and coded for the town square. I'm not sure we can afford them now, actually. So we built these little one-story shacks, and they became incubator buildings for small-scale merchants who would, if successful, graduate to bigger places. So the bookstore, which is one of the last remaining successful bookstores, started out at about 300 square feet, and now it's got about 1,000 square feet. And it's the motor kids started in a little sandwich shop and then graduated to the grocery store. And of course, we've had a lot of people who haven't succeeded for a while and then washed out. That's just part of the difficulty of doing this small-scale mom-and-pop retailing, but the rewards are very great at the same time.
And how about the rental aspect of the residential? How did you deal with that? This is not an area you're in.
Well, about 3 years into the development, we only had a dozen or so houses. We had a group of homeowners who approached Jackie Barker, our real estate manager, and asked her if she would be willing to rent houses for them. And we thought about it a lot and said, okay. Because we thought it was going to be a very important adjunct to the sales program. If people could actually test drive living in Seaside, then they were more likely to be able to feel good about buying a place there. So that, from our perspective, that was the main draw of running a rental program. There wasn't anyone else who would run it for us. There weren't vacation rental management companies in the area at that time, or none that we thought could run a rental program at the level of quality that we wanted.
You've been involved with Seaside, and you still are involved with Seaside for how many years now?
Close to 30, 28 now.
Okay, and this is another dramatically different example of how to approach real estate development. And you've described it, and others have, as acting as a town founder as opposed to a real estate developer or simply an investor who would move on very quickly. But it's an old way of doing development that maybe just went away for some time. Tell us, reflect on this, your long-term involvement in this one place.
Well, I've come to see town building as an occupation that does have a long and sometimes illustrious history. Andreas likes to point out that George Merrick's bust is sitting in the City Hall of Carl Gables, and of course, in reading Joseph Rickford's The Idea of the Town, we discover that Greek heroes were town founders, not just warriors. The town founder would have the privilege of being buried in the center of the town. Roman towns were founded by military men, but they were considered heroes as well. And it's really only recently that we've come to this kind of conventional practice of real estate project management, when you move from project to project. You try to get the project done within one business cycle, which is basically 5 or 6 years at best. And if your timing isn't right, you probably give the project back to the bank because you've leveraged it too much to hold it through an
And so the developers who've tried to figure out how you go about this and kind of scratch their head sometimes, how do you explain the financial side of this, the financial model of what makes or made Seaside work?
Well, we stumbled into this model because we had no money, and so we had to move slowly. And because of that, we have been able to ride out numerous downturns. We had a huge boom in the mid-'80s. It then collapsed when the Texas and Louisiana oil booms collapsed. Many of our neighbors gave their projects back to the bank. We actually bumped through that boom by announcing price increases every 6 months or so and selling a few lots of the old prices before it was too late. It was an advantage of having this very long-term approach and having started at very modest price levels for the first sales. But what I discovered over the past few years is that if you are building this kind of town where it actually gets better and better, where every new residence, every new store, every new restaurant actually improves the quality of life for the people who are living there, then the longer you can hang on to the real estate, the better off you're going to be. Which doesn't mean you shouldn't sell it, because you have to sell it just to keep alive. You also have to keep the whole momentum of community building going. But you don't have to, you should always position yourself so you don't ever have to sell anything at that moment in time. Because the customers can see the fear in your eyes if you're about to go down.
A lot of that.
And you also, you basically, the key to this whole thing is staying high. And if I were to advise anybody on structuring a deal, it would be buy the land with cash or with the landowner's money. Create takedowns that will pay you when we can pay you kind of deal. And borrow only enough money to do very small increments of development. Make sure you don't have to put a huge front-end investment into the beginning infrastructure amenity package. And move slowly enough that you have the staying power and that you can take advantage of the value that you're building up over time. The Nichols family held on to the Country Club Plaza until the late 90s or early 2000s, and of course sold it for enormous sums.
This is the Country Club Plaza district, which was started from the 1920s.
Right.
Well, so at this stage in your life, what are you doing now? What does the future hold in store? We know, well, I know you've done work with your Arcadia partners. Would you like to tell us about that, or what other things that you're involved with?
Well, Arcadia is a partnership of three guys. One of them is actually doing some work. Joe Dunworth is doing a number of developments in the Philadelphia region, doing very well with all of them except for the one that Beetle Ripchinsky wrote about, with Daleville. That one was built on the far urban fringe, and Chris Lineberger and I, Chris is the other partner, continually berate ourselves for not having insisted that Joe not do that one. It really was too far out there. And it violates all of the Arcadia principles, which have to do with environmental sustainability and land stewardship. Converting yet another farm into a subdivision isn't what we're all about.
We just came back from San Francisco, where I know you spend a good part of your time. Are there things we can learn from San Francisco? I remember the first time I actually interviewed you was operating in San Francisco right down the street. I have actually single-story buildings that work very well in this urban context. Why have you chosen to live in San Francisco, and what lessons do you bring from that?
Well, I live there part-time. For me, it's my vacation home. I actually started to do development there and realized that I was pushing 60 at the time, and I wouldn't live long enough to get through retirement. It was, I just didn't have the patience to deal with California land use politics, which was more bananas even here in Florida. But San Francisco is an extremely livable place. And it is so because even neighborhoods like Pacific Heights, where we're living now, have a variety of housing types at a pretty wide spread of cost. You can rent an apartment there for a couple of thousand a month. Or you can rent an apartment in one of these duplexes or triplexes. It looks like a big Victorian single-family house from the outside, and that might cost you twice that much, $5,000, $6,000 a month. Or you can buy a house for anywhere from $1 million to 20 or 30 million. So you've got this amazing spread, which, the spread of incomes violates all of the kind of conventional wisdom of real estate sales. That, you can't mix incomes like that. Well, you can. And it actually makes for a much more lively and sustainable neighborhood because all of those people occupy the small places, creating enough density that we can have great grocery stores and cafes and even decent restaurants in what is essentially a very walkable residential neighborhood.
Here's a little known side of you that I wanted to ask about. Although you're known for your work to creating walkable communities and new urbanism, and sometimes new urbanism are thought of as being anti-car, you actually are quite a car aficionado, and I hear that you make even race cars.
I do.
Okay, you want to tell us about your NASCAR side?
Well, I'm actually the opposite end of the spectrum of motorheads or arcadias. I race vintage race cars on tracks where you turn right as well as left. But I've often viewed new urbanism as an attempt by motorheads, and there are a lot of us as the founders of the movement who just love fast cars. It's an attempt on our part to keep the last remaining beautiful country roads open and free so we can still enjoy them for motoring as opposed to being stuck in our cars on a daily basis as prisons that move us from one place to the next. I've been able, as a very lucky guy, to spend very little time in my daily driver. I rarely get it out of the garage in either Seaside or San Francisco. And in San Francisco, I'm lucky enough to be able to drive 40 minutes from my house to the racetrack and get in my race car and go get my speed junkie race.
Driving is fun. I've got a couple more questions, then we'll take some from the audience. One is, as you look back on your career today, what would you say are some of the most satisfying and rewarding things about your life and work? Because really your life and work have blended together. It's not you go and do your work and then you have your life separate. What do you take some of your greatest satisfaction?
Well, certainly getting to live in wonderful places, one of which Daryl and I have helped build. But also hanging out with really interesting people. I just came from several days in Washington serving on the Driehaus Prize jury. Leon Creer and Paul Goldberger and Chatfield Taylor and all these really interesting folks. And the previous week I was in Notre Dame hanging out with Douglas Swanee and all these interesting people who are running this considers a kind of monastery, keeping the flame alive through the dark ages. And boy, that was fun. Equally satisfying has been working with a lot of young architects or now middle-aged architects, giving people their first opportunities to build things. And the roster of well-known architects who built their first buildings in Seaside is pretty amazing. It really is one of those things that
And this is my last question. Often the hardest thing for people at the beginning of their careers is figuring out how and where to start. What advice do you have, especially for younger people starting out in today's world, either in architecture or placemaking type work, community building, and particularly real estate development? Where do you start? How do you know where to begin?
Well, if I were not in school, I'd go to school. And if I were graduating and didn't have another school to go to, I'd go into Peace Corps of Vista. Because it's not going to be a lot of work for the next few years. And I do think that in both Peace Corps and Vista, you can learn a lot about community building.
There's also, we talk about, there's quite a bit of work in the public-private areas, so community redevelopment agencies, downtown development authorities, nonprofits, housing agencies. In fact, your early career involved affordable housing.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I do think that many of the nonprofits doing affordable housing now are doing a much better job than we did. We all learned a lot since then about building housing that's not stigmatized as low-income ghettos, but actually building affordable housing into mixed-income neighborhoods.
And I think the other bit of advice, you related for how J.C. Nichols started in Kansas City. How did he work his financing for his project?
Well, he just got to know rich old guys in his community.
So this is the new finance.
That's really how
the new finance is the old finance. Okay. Thank you very much for this conversation, but let's open it up. We have a lot of people here who've come out to hear you.
Chuck, and you've spent a certain amount of time on the past, as we did with the images, and giving people advice about starting out. And you spoke about one thing that you had decided not to do. Are you imagining some future projects? Or are you setting out on anything new? Are you setting out on anything new in the near future?
Yeah, we actually I'm looking at the possibility of taking over and repositioning some failed projects in the Seaside area. Bob and I have looked at the Sky project, though I think we can do the same concept better on Owl's Head than at their current location. I love the concept. I think that doing a project that integrates sustainable agriculture with the other elements of a sustainable community is probably the next interesting thing that we new urbanists and new ruralists need to be engaged with. We need to explore ways that we can grow healthier food closer to home with much lower carbon footprints in growing and processing. I would highly recommend, by the way, looking at Prairie Crossing, which is doing some remarkable things in sustainable agriculture and in educating young people in the techniques of sustainable agriculture.
Prairie Crossing, which is outside of Chicago. Northern Chicago.
I just spent several days there. So.
Any questions? It looks like you must have covered all the bases. So perhaps what we should do is just in end the evening, the formal part of the evening, and invite people to come speak with Robert Davis informally at the front of the room, and Chuck as well. Let's give a hand to both of you.